Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is John Uzzini. I see some familiar names on the chat. Welcome, folks. Good to see you and good to be connecting with some new colleagues today. I'm proud to serve as Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream for the past 7 years. And before that, I was at Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York, where I led the Teaching and Creativity Center there for several years. Our session today is titled Realizing the Promise of Professional Learning. I'm excited to be joined by some wonderful colleagues from Achieving the Dream and from OLC. I'd like to welcome our colleague Isis Arce-Vega, the Provost of Valencia College, who will join us for a conversation in a little while. Our Achieving the Dream colleague, H. Ray Keith, who serves as our Associate Director of Teaching and Learning. Brett Einen, formerly of LaGuardia Community College in the City University of New York system, and currently serving as a strategic teaching and learning coach with us at ATD. Our colleague, Professor Nicole Weber of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, unfortunately had a personal circumstance come up, couldn't be with us today, but we did want to include her on the slide. Her involvement has been critical in bringing this work to fruition, and we're sorry that Nicole can't be with us today. And finally, Professor Eric Lepp of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. So this is our team who've been engaged in this work over the past year to bring a new report to the field, and we're excited to share about that today. So I'm going to turn to Eric now to share our agenda.
Thanks, John, and welcome everybody. Greetings from the southeastern part of Wisconsin. I'm Eric Lepp. I serve on the faculty and I work in the Learning Technology Center at UW-Whitewater. And it's my pleasure to help set the stage for today. We are going to begin first with a conversation about the context in which this work was done. What are some of the challenges that we had been seeing in the field? How has equity evolved to become a central pillar in educational change, if not a central pillar in some of the research working going on in that field? And indeed, what is the state of the professional learning literature, particularly as it applies to equity? After that, we will get into the meat of the report. Really looking forward to sharing some of the highlights with you. We'll then move to something I'm very excited about, which is a conversation with Dr. Isis Arce-Vega. And then finally, we want to make sure to have some time to interact with you and have a conversation as a group about what we can do to further support your work and showcase the work in this report. So thanks so much all. And I believe we're turning it over to Brett next.
It's over to me. Thanks, Eric.
Ray, sorry, Ray.
That's okay. And so I just want to share a little bit of information as we frame our conversation today. And so as we embarked on this study, it was really important to understand the why of this work and its importance to the field, to the colleges that we were working with, to educators and the students that they serve. And so as we face the rising challenge of enrollment declines, we really want to recognize how can we be more intentional about our approach and focus as it relates to retaining our current students. And then you're really looking at how does professional learning enhance that opportunity and then impact the teaching and learning outcomes that then begins to support our students and their success. And so alongside of that, we really want to think about how are we embedding equity-minded policies and practices and instruction that positions all students for success, and specifically those students that are historically marginalized and have racialized identities within higher education. And so we must also consider how our students are being prepared to enter diverse workforces, how are they engaging as citizens that advocate and advance their prospective communities, and then global societies as well. And how does, again, professional learning, how does that play a part in all of these challenges that we've been facing in higher education?
Equity challenge, value added, a student writes at a desk.
And so educators, as we conducted this study, we really found that faculty were essential to advancing this work, especially around equity-minded efforts through evidence-based teaching that centers students and their learning and their success as well. And so in addition, we want to think about those student support services, student support strategies that lead to success outcomes, and really think about how we're intentionally partnering across institutions, making sure that faculty and student affairs practitioners are taking a holistic approach to student support and really engaging the whole student as it relates to their college experience. And then it's important to gather student feedback so that we can begin to adjust and improve our practices when we're engaging with students as it relates to career preparation, career advising, and their educational experience as a whole. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John, who's going to talk about research and professional learning.
Thank you, Ray. So our team, when we started this work a little over a year ago, did a thorough review of the literature. Some of this we had captured previously in the Achieving the Dream Teaching and Learning Toolkit, in the New Learning Compact, and these are resources that many of you may be familiar with, and we will share the links to a number of free open access resources with you as we move through our session today. But there's one key study that I just want to spotlight for a moment. It's the book Faculty Development and Student Learning, Assessing the Connections by Condon and colleagues. And they asked three really critical research questions in a study looking at the impact of faculty having participated in professional learning and what is the impact of those experiences on their students. And so the first question was, do faculty participants in sustained faculty development learn the intended new skills and approaches that the designers and facilitators of those programs would hope they learn? The second question that builds on that one is, when we look at those participants and they're engaged in sustained programs like faculty learning communities, communities of practice, faculty inquiry groups, teaching circles, when folks are participating in those kinds of sustained programs, do we see that they then make the changes we would hope they'd make in their teaching practice, in their classrooms after the fact? And then finally, if folks are making those changes in their teaching practice, are those changes associated with improvements in student outcomes? And this is really important. The answer to each of those research questions was yes. It's really interesting research, well designed, well executed. And the researchers, say at the end, I think a key takeaway is that well-designed faculty development yields great value. The connections between changes faculty make, for example, in assignments and the changes in student learning are quite clear. It's a wonderful book that we recommend, and it's just one key piece of research that we built our own work on this year. And so we see, as we look across, some years now of a really robust body of research that's developed, there's a really clear research-based value proposition. Professional learning, when it is done well, and that done well piece is quite important, and we revisit that theme repeatedly in our report, but when professional learning is done well, it advances quality and opportunities to scale innovative evidence-based practices. We see educators learning about these approaches, adapting them for their courses and in co-curricular activities, right? We're talking here about full-time faculty, part-time faculty, and folks working in student affairs. And across all of these different ways that we touch students, that we work with students, that we support their learning and their success, when we've participated in professional learning done well, those opportunities to advance change at scale and to advance equity and broad student success are only increased. So with that in mind, building on those landmark studies, this team developed a survey and a series of interviews that you'll hear about during this hour, and just a couple of months ago released this report, Teaching, Learning, Equity, and Change, Realizing the Promise of Professional Learning. And we're grateful to Achieving the Dream, to the Online Learning Consortium, and to Every Learner Everywhere for the collaboration, for the partnership on this work. So Eric's going to just share a bit about the project goals and methodology, and then Brett and Ray and I are going to share with you a series of key findings and related recommendations for the field.
The slide shows project goals.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. Following that wonderful introduction, I'll kind of summarize our project goal was really to build on a lot of the important and critical foundational research on professional learning out there, with a special emphasis on that equity piece. Our work did evaluate some broader questions about the role and station of professional learning in higher education, considering questions like how is professional learning structured at various institutions, what kinds of external resources and partnerships are most helpful for promoting professional growth. But again, we had a real emphasis and special interest in understanding the experiential distinction between people working in a primarily white institutional context versus a minority serving institutional context on issues like resource and opportunity availability related to professional learning. We looked at questions like what tools are more or less available to different institutions serving different populations of students, what challenges are more and less prominent. This focus on equity represents a significant difference and we hope expansion and advancement of some of the prior work conducted in this space. And ultimately, we want to empower institutions of all types to advance equity-focused change using professional learning as a vehicle for doing so. With that, we can jump to the next slide, please.
New data on essential institutions.
And we'll talk just a little bit about the methodology. As a social scientist, I always like to give an overview of how did we do what we do. I'm really happy to report that we had the opportunity with this project to conduct both quantitative and qualitative analyses. They both have a really important role in research, so mixed methods tend to yield the most rich and fruitful outcomes. On the quantitative side, we did a survey that had somewhere between 90 and 120 people respond. It varied from question to question, but on average about 100 people. And they represented a variety of institutional types. You can see on the right, one thing we were very fortunate to successfully do with this project is ensure that we had a lot of broad access institutions participate in the study, as well as some of the more traditional research-oriented institutions and some of the ones that often are more involved in this kind of work. We were very deliberate about spreading that attention around, and I think we succeeded in getting a lot of different voices in the project. Even though I'm a survey methodologist, and I think it's a very important approach to understanding the human condition and the human experience, there's a depth and a richness you can't quite get with surveys. So we coupled that quantitative work with in-depth interviews with 20 different professional learning leaders in a variety of roles and at a variety of institutions across the country. We were again very deliberate about making sure different institutional contexts, different regions, and different levels of success in professional learning were represented in those conversations so we could get a wide and hopefully a pretty comprehensive view of the state of the field. So with that, I believe now I can turn things over to Brett. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. So one thing it's worth mentioning that we did that was somewhat unusual in this survey. Looking at that data, we looked at it through a lens of evidence-based standards for good practice. What do we mean by that? John mentioned earlier the notion of professional learning done well. There's lots of different approaches to professional learning and lots of ones that can work, but there is a growing body of research that suggests that certain approaches are much more effective than others. And that research is vast. We have some new tools that distill that research into a set of frameworks for professional learning done well or high impact professional learning. One of those is the Center for Teaching and Learning Matrix, put out by the American Council for Education, and POD, the Professional and Organizational Developers Network. There's also the New Learning Compact, which some of us here worked on, which took a lot of the research and thought about what kinds of designs seem to work well, and where is there evidence for designs of professional learning programs that work well, and what kinds of institutional supports seem to make the most difference. That work in the New Learning Compact was extended and detailed in ATD's Teaching and Learning Toolkit. So go ahead, John. So you can see these are some of the kinds of principles that we talked about in those publications that the evidence suggests there are strong good practice principles at the individual and community dimension that focus on the design and facilitation of programs, and at the institutional and ecosystem dimension that have to do with the ways that professional learning is situated in a systemic way and supported in that way. So we took these dimensions between those two tools and looked at what we could see.
A slide shows information across 4 areas.
How does professional learning practice at minority serving institutions and community colleges align with these principles? Where is there evidence of strong alignment, and where do we see challenges and gaps? And what kind of help then would be most effective in strengthening programs on these institutions? So the bottom line on this, go ahead, John. If we're going to tour through spotlight a few findings, but the overall finding is this. While we found there was a lot of interest in professional learning at the institutions that we were focused on,
Text the takeaway.
that interest has not always been matched by systemic investment and a consistent set of high impact practices. And so one of the things we're looking at as we go through the rest of the session is where do we find alignment and where were there some gaps? So as we go, one thing I'll just mention here before we start to dig in is if you have questions that you want to ask, please put those in the chat and we'll be keeping an eye on that. And after we've looked at some of the findings and recommendations and talked with Dr. Arcevega, we'll have a chance to surface some of those questions. So I just want to invite people to be doing that as we go. Go ahead, John. Who's up next? Ray.
All right, that's me. Thank you, Brett. And this is really one of my favorite parts of the report is the findings and, conducting the research. And so as you see here, our key findings, one of the key findings from the report aligns with the 2016 study as it relates to systemic underfunding and staffing of CTLs. And what you'll see on the graph here is disparities in funding and staffing as it relates to CTLs at PWIs and MSIs. And so without committed and dedicated funding, many of these CTLs are impeded in providing comprehensive professional learning resources and services that support faculty development. And so in our study, what we found is many of the CTLs and professional learning hubs at community colleges or MSIs were staffed by a single person or a faculty member that had received course release time. Many times these offices were not centrally located on the campus. Folks were not getting that foot traffic. Many faculty members might not have known exactly where those places were located. And these CTLs, because of the lack of funding, were not able to provide robust professional learning and support for the faculty on those campuses. And so we really want to begin to think about from these findings, how do we begin to make those changes so that professional learning can really be at the center of an institution and be part of the strategic planning as well. And so we're going to move into our recommendations. And what you'll see here, John, if you'll go to the next slide, what we're recommending is that institutions are strategic and intentional about investing in professional learning and CTLs in ways that, again, it really is at the center of the college's infrastructure. And that there's an opportunity to intentionally advance teaching and learning, which then can lead to improved student outcomes and also supporting our faculty in advancing their own teaching and learning skills. And so by providing this intentional space where faculty can engage in professional learning with one another, and also making sure that that's meaningful to them and that we're providing a breadth of an in-depth of professional learning that really is going to advance strategic initiatives on the campus. And so I'm going to turn it over to John, I believe.
Thank you, Ray. So I'm going to point to two gaps that we identified and then a related recommendation. And so first here, some gaps that we see around faculty engagement. So, as I pointed to earlier, research shows that the most effective professional learning programs are those that are co-constructed. We think that's a really important idea. And, we are drawing here on culturally responsive pedagogy. Teaching in ways that are co-constructed is one of the key tenets of that pedagogical approach. And we see real opportunities in professional learning. And the research tells us that the professional learning that is co-constructed, where we are engaging educators as partners, when we are leveraging their expertise to advance change, these are the most effective programs. But the gap here is that in our findings, more than half of our respondents shared that faculty do not feel that their expertise is being recognized in the professional learning programs in which they're participating. Now, we do see some real areas of strength. Colleges like Valencia, where our guest is from, Also, Florida State College at Jacksonville are doing really interesting work to engage faculty as co-leaders, as partners. They're really leveraging that expertise, and these are programs that are clearly co-constructed. So while we see gaps, we also identified some real exemplar institutions in our research. A second key finding points to an over-reliance on one-off or one-shot workshops. We know that most CTLs, most professional learning programs rely on workshops because there are lots of good reasons why we do that. They are less expensive in terms of the funding needed. They're less time intensive. They're easier to plan, and it's easier, frankly, for participants, faculty, and others to commit to attending because it's just an hour or maybe 90 minutes of their time. But the research tells us there's real limitations of this approach, and that more sustained programs like faculty learning communities and communities of practice really have a much greater impact on our practice. So despite understanding that those more sustained programs can have a much greater impact on practice, we see that workshops continue to be the most common professional learning structure across all sectors. About 85% of minority serving institutions in our sample told us that workshops are central elements of their work. Now, again, there are opportunities here, and we see some really great examples in the field of institutions that are navigating through this kind of gap. So Wilkes Community College in North Carolina and some other exemplary programs are using faculty learning communities to support their educators, full-time and part-time faculty, as they learn about new pedagogies and test them with students and reflect on their learning. It's a great opportunity for educators to come together and to continue to push each other and support each other's practice. So our recommendation here, that's informed by these findings, is that we really need to rethink our programs to engage high impact design. The resources that Brett shared just a few minutes ago, and which we will link to towards the end of our session today, provide a range of standards based in evidence collected from institutions across the country. And if we use these national standards, we can re-examine our programs and move beyond workshops in a well-informed way. And these models, these research-based models, provide lots of opportunities for us to design more engaging and more sustained programs that will support our colleagues, our full-time and part-time faculty colleagues, our colleagues in student affairs, in a collective process of inquiry, reflection, and change. I'm going to turn now to Brett to present our last set of findings and recommendations.
Thanks, John. So you can see that we're thinking at both levels. Institutions and systems need to invest more strategically in professional learning. The professional learning leaders need to think about how to deepen their own practice in order to make it more effective. And it's really a 1-2. It's got to be both and. It's not an either or. We need that, more effective investment, that larger, more strategic investment. We also need the well-designed high-impact programs. So thinking at the systemic level, one of the things that's really important is how do institutions support educators participating in professional learning? How do you motivate it, incentivize it? There's lots of different ways that institutions do that. There's stipends and release time and other kinds of programs, but they have limitations in terms of being cost effective and sustainable, particularly when you're trying to do programs at scale. So what the research shows is that schools that are most effective in their professional learning work leverage the power of reward systems by recognizing, validating, and motivating participation in professional learning through the promotion and tenure process, particularly for full-time faculty. And this is something that perhaps ECs might talk about, because we saw that Valencia is really an exemplar in the ways in which this is built into the culture and structure of professional life at Valencia. But what we saw was that 3 out of 4 of our respondents
Text key finding.
Said that this is not a consistent practice at our institutions. So this is something that we think will make a big difference if institutions are able to be more systematic in using the tools, the cost-effective tools that are available to them to support and incentivize participation. Go ahead, John.
Slide text, underserving part-time faculty.
So that's, something that, we want to draw folks' attention to, and it's particularly helpful in terms of, promotion and tenure apply most to full-time faculty. But we can't limit our focus to full-time faculty. Part-time faculty, as all of us know, teach a huge proportion of our classes. At 50 to 60% of the teaching population in community colleges are part-time. So at the same time, when we asked people about who takes part in their programs, we saw that participation of part-time faculty is in the low 20s. So our part-time faculty are being underserved. If that pattern continues, we will never bring change to scale. We will never effectively serve all of our students. We did see some really smart programs. I saw there's somebody in the audience from Montgomery College. We saw really exciting work being done there. Montgomery just won an award for its work engaging part-time faculty. Harper College, similarly, I think there's somebody in the audience from Harper College. And what we've seen in the research is that these colleges have come up with methods to encourage part-time faculty leadership and participation, and find places in the reward structure that can help encourage and validate the participation of part-time faculty. So one of our recommendations is that that colleges look at those systems and start to employ them more effectively to engage part-time faculty. Go ahead, John.
Text, investing in part-time faculty at Montgomery College.
Last finding and recommendation that we want to spotlight comes from a slightly different angle. We're very aware, as I'm sure all of you are, that our institutions don't operate in a vacuum. We're part of systems, whether those are state systems, accreditation systems, networks of higher education organizations, and funders are all elements of the higher ed ecosystem. And we think that the
people sit at a table.
Building capacity in professional learning, strengthening our professional learning work at community colleges and minority serving institutions is so important that all of our ecosystem partners should be paying attention to this. If we want to achieve equity, this is a key priority. So we asked our participants what kinds of assistance would be most helpful in advancing professional learning on their campuses. And you can see the answers there on the left. So the highest rated was help us develop a long-term plan for strengthening our professional development work. Other really highly rated items were help our campus leadership learn ways to strategically deploy professional development, help our professional learning leaders familiarize themselves with evidence-based professional learning resources and strategies. We also asked about the kinds of assistance that groups like ACU are providing, where they provide direct professional development or professional learning programs for faculty. And there was definitely interest in that. 55% of our respondents said that would be helpful. It's worth noting that was the lowest rated item of all the ones we offered, that there was much greater interest, notably stronger interest in building campus-based capacity. So we want to encourage system leaders and funders and higher education networks to be thinking about what kinds of programs they can be offering that will help campuses, particularly MSIs and community colleges, build capacity for high impact professional learning.
Text, spur change.
So this is a collective responsibility. It's a collective effort. We're thinking about how can we all work together. There's work to be done at the level of professional learning leaders, campus administrators, and systems leaders and funders. So this gives you a quick sense of our the report. And at the end of the session, we'll provide the links where you can drill down and read it yourself and find links to the kinds of resources that can guide high impact practice. We'll want to take your questions, but before we do, we're really honored to have with us our colleague Isis Artzavega, who is the provost at Valencia College and a national thought leader in professional learning and equity-minded teaching. And Valencia College is one of our exemplary colleges. So we're really honored to have Isis with us. And we want to spend a few minutes inviting her to share some thoughts about professional learning and this report. So Isis, so delighted to have you with us.
Dr. Isis Artzavega.
I'm so happy to be here, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Great. So we thought we'd just start with a big picture question to start off.
5 people on a video screen.
You've got a great position for thinking about this, both at Valencia and your work around the country. From your perspective, how important is professional learning to our collective efforts to advance equity and student success? And why is it particularly important to build capacity for professional learning at MSIs and community colleges?
Brett, I want to say, and I imagine because you're here, many of you might agree. I would say crucial. How important? I would say it's crucial. And to start, I kind of would offer a kind of macro version of the why. I imagine some of you are familiar with this construct of being a student-ready college instead of continuing to wait for students to be college-ready and pointing to what else students could know or learn or do, and really taking back some of that responsibility, recognizing that it was always our responsibility as institutional leaders, faculty, and staff to do right by students by continuing to prepare ourselves to do this really difficult work that we do. I don't think, no matter what our academic pathways were, that any job really fully prepared us. So there's a humility inherent in here that I think is crucial to advancing all of our outcomes, including our equity work. And in community colleges, at MSIs in particular, I would want to stress, as your work does, professional learning for faculty. For so many of our students, their college experience is mediated by faculty, and the impact of faculty cannot be, I can't say enough about the impact of faculty on student success, from everything from their learning, which is why they are, of course, enrolled, but even really concrete items like their financial aid eligibility, which is often lost as the result of a grade, which is, of course, a construct that comes from faculty decisions, assessments, and grading practices. So all roads lead to faculty just playing a crucial role in terms of student wellness, success, whether they think they belong at an institution, whether they believe they can succeed academically. And so for all of these reasons, and given our institutional priorities around access and success and learning, we can't do enough in this area.
Yeah, it's really striking that a lot of the equity focused efforts in higher ed over the past couple of decades have not prioritized faculty. So I'm really glad you're spotlighting that. Thinking about that, how we work with faculty, really all educators. What are some of the key principles for professional learning done well from your perspective? And maybe there's things that you might want to spotlight from your work at Valencia that help people understand what that looks like.
I'm happy to do so. And you probably have heard this disclaimer of mine, but I have been at Valencia for only 4 years. And that culture of learning centeredness and commitment to professional learning was here long before I got here. So it also makes it easier for me to celebrate that effort that I only have indirectly been a part of. So that's my disclaimer, and also my appreciation for my colleagues who did all of the hard work at Valencia. In terms of principles for high impact professional learning, I would first state something that sounds obvious, but a focus on actual learning. And I say this because in some of our efforts to advance student progression, graduation, completion, we kind of deviate away from learning, and completion and progression are not synonymous. And so I say this because there is no equity without learning. Our credentials only reap their intended impact if students know and are able to do things, right? So that's first and foremost. But I also would have us prioritize learning and real learning, because otherwise we will lose our faculty partners and their engagement. As soon as faculty think we are suggesting, or even they, might hear in our efforts, oh, you want me to lower standards or reduce rigor, that is problematic, because they do feel responsibility for learning. And I would want learning outcomes to be front and center, together with some of those more traditional student success outcomes in the design of professional learning. The second one I would say is one that John referenced and is front and center in the report, which is careful design. And one of the core elements of that Condon study that John referenced, the reason that they saw and were able to trace their PD, right, all the way to student learning outcomes, is because they designed it so thoughtfully. They really did. Some of you may have experience writing grants, and I think about that logic model. That really careful, if we do this, it will lead to this, which should lead to this. And if we can carry that logic all the way to student outcomes, that is the high bar. But that careful design between what you are hoping that individuals will learn as a result of that professional learning, and designing it really carefully, just like good course design. And often our professional learning is more topic focused, I would say, than a really carefully designed experience with a strong evaluation. The third principle I would suggest, and I promise I only have 4, the third is deep care and concern and respect for the human beings involved. Faculty are conscientious, brilliant problem solvers who work really hard. And so thinking about them and the other members of the community, faculty and staff, what is their experience? How do we want them to feel as they engage with this professional learning experience? No one wants to feel like they're on a receiving end of a training, like someone's waving a finger at them and suggesting they're not doing their jobs well. So that careful attention to the human beings and the respect that is due. And then the last one I would say is when we also reference that co-creation, that co-design. Often, and at Valencia, I was stunned when I arrived to see that all of the faculty development effort is designed with faculty and actually mostly facilitated by faculty for their peers. So that's a way that Valencia models that principle. And we are slowly easing into more co-design and co-facilitation with students that I'm really excited about. Often we see them again as the beneficiaries of our work on the receiving end, when in fact we know, and some really powerful models are showing us that professional learning in partnership with students is really powerful and kind of untapped, as it were, in our current work.
Yeah, I think that's really a cutting edge. And if you think about the ways in which all of your principles add up, it's really a way to have a learning-centered organization, a learning organization, which everybody is engaged in that learning process.
100%. If I can take them, because I didn't say one of my favorite things that Valencia made happen with a lot of work. And as early as the 90s, they declared, we want to be a learning-centered institution. And your question of what does that look like in practice? It means that when I got here, I heard this question over and over again. As we designed an initiative or launched a project, someone would say, will this advance student learning? How do we know? So it's a discipline of asking that question, because it is not an add-on, it is a cultural expectation.
Yeah, that's so vital. We could talk about that for a long time, but I want to, give you a chance to comment specifically on the report. And are there particular takeaways that you would want to spotlight from the report that you think that are particularly important for people to be aware of?
Absolutely. Three things stood out to me in particular. One was one that you noted earlier, Brett, which is that gap between aspiration and practice. Yeah. And this stayed with me, right, as somebody who it stayed with me in the form of a question, right? Why? What might account? And I have some hypotheses But one of them is that leaders may not be sure where to start, and they might think that unless they have tons of time or money, they can't do this, right? And so I hope that I can try to debunk that. And I would suggest what are that they ask themselves, what are some small steps that we might be able to use, and some high impact steps, pulling data so that they are not, launching a workshop or a faculty learning community and then disappointed that it doesn't yield results. So really starting with some data so that they know that the area of focus, the course, the discipline, the pedagogy is likely to yield the kind of result that would signal to them success. And I'll use an example. Before I was at Valencia, I was at Florida International University in Miami. And so I was in a center of two, and it's a very large university. And so, I've always been a strategic thinker, or maybe not always, but for a long time. And I said, well, if I'm going to talk to faculty and I can't work with all of them, can you send me a list of those who teach the most students every year? Those, and in FIU's case, the faculty teaching the large lecture halls, who really were in front of thousands of students. Okay, so I designed an opportunity for them. And so starting with something small, a faculty learning community, a book group, a multi-part series, right? Not a one-time workshop, with a group of individuals or a course where we are seeing institutionally at the data say, something might not be quite right here, or there's an opportunity for improvement here. And then taking that time to study it. I think that as FIU did, and as Valencia did a bit earlier, you will notice the impact, and in seeing those results, we have seen fuel subsequent commitments and investments. The second item that stood out to me was the exhaustion. It was heavy on my heart, and part of why that principle of attending to the human beings is so important to me. So I can't stress that enough. And then this idea of high impact professional learning, and the fact that it's not all created equal, and John spoke to that. So sustained faculty development, really, I would say data informed faculty development, clear and very strong design and alignment between inputs and outputs. When we do all of that is when we see the outcomes that we that we endeavor to see.
Yeah, that combination of, thinking about it at all those levels, I think that's so critical. I want to ask you one more question and then make sure that we have time for, questions from our group. So our research, as we talked about, suggests that there's a critical role for funders in the higher ed ecosystem, and that if we're trying to advance professional learning as a tool for equity, student learning, and success, what would you want to say to funders about
Zoom call.
Their role and what they could be doing
Zoom call.
To advance this whole effort across higher ed?
Yeah. When I was thinking about this question ahead of time, I didn't have access to the slides. So I want to kind of reference that one of the last slides that you showed, Brett, with the what individuals on the campuses said would be most helpful to them. And I want to reinforce a few of those and add one of my own. This idea of helping institutions and leaders develop a long-term plan, that's hard. And so some guidance initiatives that have them in community building that work and designing that work, I think is a really, really strong idea. Helping individuals familiarize themselves with those high impact. So yes, we know about professional learning, but I think fewer among us know that there are some higher impact practices and how to design those in a really intentional way. The item that I would add to this list is the evaluation part, because it is so famously difficult to do, even amongst the most seasoned of professional learning or educational developers. So I would say help with the evaluation. And for me, that is a key part of the design, because if just as we ask faculty to be really intentional in designing their courses and to know if students are learning and to iterate if they're not, we need to model that behavior. We design with care, we evaluate along the way, and we iterate because we don't want to misuse anyone's time. We don't want to continue an initiative just because we named it or started it. So for me, that is a difficult area. And I think we could really advance our work by working together and some ecosystem at the ecosystem level and with some funding. I think we could get really pretty far in that area.
Excellent. That's so helpful, Isis. Thank you so much. So we want to save the rest of the time for surfacing some questions from the audience here, from our participants. And those can be questions for Isis or any one of the report authors.
Woman drinks water.
Or just generally to raise questions. And I see there's been some lively conversation in the chat, which is fabulous. And John, are there particular questions that you would like to suggest we take on?
Sure, and I do want to say thank you to everyone who's been engaging in the chat. There's been some nice examples shared back and forth in response to the questions. And I will say, if you'd like to ask a question and you'd like to, we'd certainly love to hear your voice. So please feel free, to raise your hand using the feature in Zoom, and our colleague Dana Anderson Ward will, help you to unmute so that you can ask that question. Our colleague Megan Tessine from APLU has raised her hand. So I think we'll start with Megan's question. If Megan can unmute, and then I've got a question from the chat that I will surface after that. Megan, are you able? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Oh.
Megan, are you able to unmute? So I'm going to go ahead with a question from the chat while we wait on Megan. There was, I think an important theme that came up in a number of the questions in the chat, asking about, how institutions can provide the resources that faculty need. And it's not just, a stipend or, and certainly money is important, but it's also about time. It's about the space to do this. And I think what we saw in the conversation, where the conversation was going in the chat, was that this is ultimately about culture, that when colleges can really shift their culture and make the case that professional learning is a core part of what it means to be an effective teacher, then it's not just about a stipend for each, a transaction. So I don't want to minimize the importance of stipends, and it's certainly not about asking people to do things and not compensating them, but it's also about something bigger. And I wonder if, folks, Isis or Brett or others from our team just want to speak a little bit more to that issue of organizational culture.
Isis, would you want to speak about that? I think Valencia does a great job on that.
I couldn't agree more. And again, I came into a culture that had done that work and invested a lot of time. Some of the ways that both Valencia and frankly FIU named this as a cultural priority was to put it into the strategic plan. So at FIU, particularly as a research university, it was a really big deal for teaching and learning and a teaching focused initiative to be named as one of a handful of strategic priorities. So some important symbols like that we're going to change. We're really committing to this. And here are the investments at FIU that came with some funding to expand the center. So when I left, I was no longer in a center of two. And I want to go back to your point, John, about what else does it take? I think it also takes the motivation, the support, right? So there can be a willingness on behalf of faculty, but there have to be people to help with them, right? Because these are hard changes to make in our pedagogy. So what is the support? What are the motivations? What are those capacities like time, right? Giving a little bit of time and space and support to move the work, and then naming it in those high symbolic moments like a strategic plan, I think are key steps in creating and cultivating that culture.
Thank you, Isis. I see that Gabby has her hand up. Gabby, are you able to unmute and share?
K-12 for over 30 years as a faculty member, and it is part of the culture to reflect on your pedagogy and reflect and have continuous improvement. Having now been at higher ed for the last 4 years, I don't see that as being the culture here. And I think that it's very difficult for some faculty who feel that they're experts in their field to also simultaneously hold that they're not necessarily experts in teaching or pedagogy, and that being able to have help, ask for help, self-reflect, find things you can do better is a really difficult ask. I'm wondering if anybody can speak to that directly.
Ray, is that something you might want to speak to?
I think definitely this is something that's emerging in higher education. And so as we think about faculty members being experts and thinking about their own professional development, as we think about that, how are we educating our faculty members as it relates to teaching and learning practices, to pedagogy, and then how are we making sure that those pedagogies are student-centered and culturally responsive? And so I think we have to build that culture at institutions so that the folks are doing that reflective work, but also becoming reflexive practitioners where it's not just reflecting on my practices, but also thinking about how do I change those practices? How do I assess those practices? How do I modify my teaching practices and really take a cyclical approach to the way that they're engaging in teaching and learning?
Yeah, a piece of that that's keep piggybacking on, because there's so many things we could talk about there, and everything that Ray said is right on the money. One of the key pieces in terms of best practice in professional learning is the creation of supportive communities of practice, where faculty, other educators can talk about what's actually happening. Because as Isis said, this is hard work. We're going to stumble. It's part of being human. It's part of, doing the challenging craft. And so there's changing kind of shifting the larger culture, which is a long-term process, but we can start by creating pockets of conversation where people are talking about teaching, talking about specific issues in teaching, and they're able to talk about what's working, but also what's not working. And that's not.
Don't like to struggle.
I'm sorry. Could you say again?
Experts don't like to struggle. It's
exactly
therapy. You have to really work hard at it.
Yeah, and that our learning very often happens at those points of the struggle, right? That prompts us, because it's part of what you see is point to. People want to do good work. People want to teach well. They care about their students. And so it's not a question of people don't care. It's a question of where's the opportunity to have those conversations in a supportive environment that, as Ray said, kind of pushes us to engage in the deep reflection on our practice and become ongoing learners.
If I could just add two quick things, because it's such an important question. First, to reinforce that last point, Brett, of creating safety and earning trust so that faculty can be vulnerable, which is really hard. But two other strategies I would add to it. One is the specificity of the professional learning. I think COVID gave us a great example. It was, I saw much less defensiveness in, I have never taught online, now I have to, please help me, right? So if we can find topics or areas where faculty might be easier for them to say, well, of course, I don't know how to do this yet. This is brand new. And the area of equity-minded pedagogy, I would say, offers a lot of opportunity there. These were not my experiences. Let's talk about, what we can learn about these students who are fundamentally different from who I am or how I learned. And then the last one I would say is data. One of the projects we're developing now in this culture of highly autonomous and pedagogically savvy faculty is, I'm really worried about my faculty even perceiving that I think that they're not doing a great job, because I know that they are. So I'm designing an inquiry project where I'm helping them to access data so that they can see the data, they can ask questions of the data, and they can then decide how they want to respond to what they notice. So that is another kind of hands-off approach that I think I'm optimistic will yield good results.
Yeah. John, is there another question from the chat that you would like to surface?
Yeah, so I want to bring up a nice point from David Scobie. He says there are interesting experiments for 2-year, 4-year faculty partnerships that go beyond articulation agreements. And he's wondering, are there opportunities for local cross-sector professional learning programs which might also educate four-year faculty about the work ATD and others have been doing with community colleges. So I'm just going to share one quick point and then see who else would like to add to that. ATD has been doing some interesting work for the past few years on regional professional learning communities, where community colleges are positioned as hubs for these efforts in their communities, bringing together partners from K through 12 sector, four-year institutions, and also workforce interests, local employers, people from workforce development agencies, and so on. And I placed a link in the chat a little while ago to a facilitator's guide that we released a couple of months ago. I think my colleague Tanya Scott is on the call, and she's been leading that work that's generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'll also share that Peter Felton and I and our colleagues Tazeen Daniels and Amy Johnson have been working on a chapter for a book that I think is due out either late in 23 or early in 24 about that need for community college educators and folks from four-year institutions to be in deeper conversation with each other, and for the kinds of more robust learning that could be going on across these boundaries. So that's just a couple of examples I'll share, but I'd love to turn to others here on the panel.
I would only say that I think that a key prerequisite for making that effective is, but also a possible outcome, is the development of mutual respect and trust across those lines. That's, speaking from my experience within CUNY, I will say that wasn't always there. And that has to be finding ways to bring educators together to have a conversation on the understanding that everybody is bringing something to the table, just like we're talking about in all these other contexts, valuing the expertise that people are bringing, and not coming in with a hierarchical notion of who knows something and who doesn't, I think is really fundamental to the success.
I'll throw in really quick, just as we wrap up, that the mutual respect is certainly part of it. I'd also argue it's a prerequisite to genuine collaboration, and involving, involving your instructors as being leaders, champions, and advocates, inviting them to work with a CETL to co-host an event, or invite in-house lectures on things, showcase what you're doing. I will share just shamelessly, although there's no money involved. I just had a report come out with a student. A student and I did a report where we researched pandemic teaching and learning on campus. And one of the things we found was even the two of us debating which questions go on the survey was incredibly enlightening as far as what were our respective priorities. We have room for 25 questions. What do we ask about? And hearing from, having the student help set the agenda for what we talked about really then set the stage for having a good conversation about the data that came afterwards. And then we brought that to our CETL to kind of inform the content, and people feel empowered to contribute, not just as participants, but as partners in the process. And I know in my interviews, several people mentioned success stories of bringing in their peers and not just delivering to them. So the respect is a great prerequisite for that, and I certainly encourage both.
People on the Zoom call listen.
Well,
go ahead, John.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brett.
Well, I was just going to say, I think I'm seeing all sorts of questions popping up now in the chat, and I'm also aware that we're at time.
Man speaks on the call.
So we really appreciate the level of engagement and the thoughtful questions, and the expertise of everybody in this group. And so that it's really been exciting to feel that. We'll follow up with a follow-up note that perhaps points to some of these resources.
Speaker gestures.
Places where we can learn more and think about how we could engage in further conversation and collaboration. So, John, you want to wrap us up?
Brett, thank you. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our special guest and friend, Dr. E.C. Sarce Vega, this wonderful team that I have the pleasure of working with, Brett and Ray and Eric, our ATD colleague, Dana Anderson Ward, for all her support in the background here today. In the chat, you hopefully saw links to the resources we shared, this report, Teaching, Learning, Equity, and Change, a free open access article in Change magazine about the New Learning Compact, and the Achieving the Dream Teaching and Learning Toolkit. and also a link to an evaluation form, very brief evaluation, but we do really appreciate the feedback on these sessions, and that feedback will inform our work going forward. So we will follow up with an email to you all that has all of that, plus the recording from today. But if you were able to grab those links from the chat, that's great too. Thanks so much again, everyone, for your engagement, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you.